In this training session, we're going to take a look at event log filter thresholds. If you navigate to the email notification package that should be present on every EventSentry installation, it may be grayed out if it's not assigned. And let's take a look at the second filter here, email critical events. And you can see that this filter has a threshold because there's a little ruler associated with the icon. If you click here, you'll notice this filter is disabled. If we enable it, it also gets that little ruler. And there's a tab here for thresholds, and the little informational icon here, of course, indicates that this tab has data that it is configured. So we know here, okay, we have custom event logs and we have thresholds. We don't have any settings here. Time and hour, day are actually empty. We don't need this. So what's the purpose of these thresholds? Well, there's generally two. One is obviously to limit the number of events that are being sent to an action, and the other one being to detect certain activity. So let's take a look at this dialog, and let's walk through it from top to bottom. The first setting you're going to see is the ability to switch between agent and collector side thresholds. So if it's being processed on the agent side, then it is the agent that essentially controls and enforces the threshold. But if you're using a collector, then you can also have these thresholds being evaluated on the collector side, which has certain advantages, especially for events that are correlated, especially for events that are related, but may not always be logged only on one host. So think about audit failures, for example, coming from multiple domain controllers. It may make sense to make that a collector side threshold. But we're going to start with agent side thresholds, and a lot of the functionality applies to both in any case. So in the most basic setup here, as we have it configured for this filters, this is email critical events. Filters that will forward warnings and errors to an email action by default. And of course, we never know how many errors or warnings are going to be written to the event log. Most of the time, it's not that much, but there may be a situation where some process gets out of control and you have 100 or 1,000 events per hour being written to the event log. We don't want to send all those to the email, so that's why we employ a threshold. So here we can say, okay, we are limiting this to 10 events in 1 hour. And as far as event processing is concerned, we're saying, okay, we want to forward these events until the threshold is reached and nothing afterwards. If we check this box, then we could essentially invert that. So there may be cases where you don't want to get the events before the threshold is reached. So in that case, you would check that box instead. Obviously, checking both boxes doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So you would switch it to this. So then in this case, you would not get the first 10 events, but you would get the 11th event. And another option is to forward the first event only. So you may, this is useful, for example, for audit failures, right? So you may say, well, I don't want to get the first 5 because it's very normal that somebody will log in with the wrong password. I don't want to get all the failed ones afterwards. So if somebody tries, let's say 15 times, I don't want to get the last 10 or last 5 events. So then you can check that checkbox. And what that basically means is that if somebody logs on with the wrong password, you will get the 11th event sent to you, but not any of the other ones. So you'll know that it's happening. You know that if you're getting that event, the first, this person or this user has already tried 10 times. But you'll only get the 11th one. We will not get every subsequent one, which could be up to any number, really. I'm going to set this back to this here. And the next option is event logging. So EventSentry can log an event to the event log when the threshold is met. So in this particular case, let's say 10 audit failures occurred in the first hour after, let's say, 10 minutes. Then after those 10 minutes, so when that 10th event is being logged, that's when EventSentry will write the entry to the event log, or you can check this checkbox, in which case the event will be logged after the threshold period has elapsed, which would be 1 hour. So again, you could do both, or you could just do that one, which means the threshold will be in place. After the 10th event has been forwarded, it will not forward any more events, but you will not see an actual alert in the event log until the full time period has elapsed, in which case you can also see a little bit more information about how many were forwarded and how many events were essentially blocked. Now let's take a look at the threshold matching options. There's two different ways that events can count towards an actual threshold. One is via filter and the other one via event properties. And you can see that those are very, very different. The first option, the matching based on filters, is a lot more simple. And basically what that means is that anytime a filter processes an event that matches the filter, of course, the threshold gets increased by 1 until the threshold is met. So if in this particular case, this filter will apply to any error or critical event that's being logged to any of the event logs. So it really doesn't matter what they are, if they're application event logs, system event logs, DNS errors, they all are thrown into one bucket. And if that bucket reaches the threshold, then the threshold is met and no more, and that filter will stop processing these events. So that's obviously very easy to understand. If we set this to event properties, then we have two ways of grouping these events and essentially creating dynamic thresholds based on event properties. So what do I mean by that? So let's take a look at this filter here example. Let's consider this example. We have this filter that matches any error in any of the event logs. But let's say we want to have separate thresholds for each event log, meaning we're okay getting up to 10 events for each event log. So saying, okay, if there's 10 errors in the application event log, we want to get all those per email. And if there's 10 errors in the system event log, we're okay getting those sent by email. So what we would do in that case, we would simply check the log button. And what that would mean is that anytime an event is processed by this filter, the event counter, so the threshold counter, is going to be applied to that event's event log property. So an event is logged to the application event log as an error, well then there's going to be a threshold object in memory that essentially is set to 1. And the second time an error occurs in the application event log, that counter is now set to 2. Now if another event comes along from the system event log, then it gets its own threshold counter that's also going to be initialized with 1. And if each of those reaches 10, then that threshold will be met and no more events will be processed. But it also means that in this case, you can get as many as 10 events for each log this filter encounters. And then you could do the same thing, of course, for other properties of the event. Severity, in this case, wouldn't really make much sense because this event filter really only applies to errors, and critical events are pretty rare. But if we were to enable warning and errors, then we could also click the severity button here instead, or in addition, and then we would have our own counters for each warning and error. So we could get 10 warnings, we could get 10 errors. If we create a combination here, then each combination would get its own object, meaning that an application log error would be one object, and application log warning would be an object, and the same goes for every other log as well. So that means you could get up to 10 emails for a warning in the application event log and up to 10 emails for an error in the application event log, and then for every other log that you're monitoring. So that is how the threshold matching works on these event properties. And then on top of that, to make it even more interesting, we can also create custom counters for insertion strings. And that's particularly useful. And the main reason this exists is for security events. And I have a nice little diagram here that illustrates this. So if we consider a large domain environment, let's just say 1,000 users, then we can expect a certain number of audit failures. People are just going to accidentally type in the wrong password. So if we consider the time period in the morning, let's say between 7 and 9 a.m. in the morning, 1,000 users log on, there's a pretty high chance that we'll encounter several audit failures. And the regular threshold that we have set up that counts per filter isn't really going to be that useful, because if we say, okay, we only want to get the first 10 events per hour, you may just get random audit failures from people typing in their password incorrectly, but you're not going to get subsequent ones. And you're certainly not going to detect a single user, for example, trying to log on multiple times. And that could be a script or some malicious activity going on in the network that maybe runs at exactly that time to obfuscate and hide. So what you can do in that case, you can use insertion strings that represent the username and create dynamic threshold objects and counters based on that username. So if we look at the top there, we have a variety of logon events that are happening on the domain with various users. So examples are user A, B, C, and D. And we're extracting, so we know that insertion string number 5, and there's another video that explains what insertion strings are, but insertion string number 5 for event 4624 represents the secured ID, the logon, the user login on. So those are now going to get their own little threshold objects. So user A, so when they log on, they get a threshold object created dynamically that will be valid for as long as that threshold period is set. So for example, in this screenshot, we have 3 minutes. And as a side note, this example uses event ID 4624, which is actually a successful login. But of course, this can be applied to any type of login, whether it's a failed, successful event, whether it's a process start and so forth. But back to the concept of this. So any time this event that matches the filter is encountered, insertion string number 5 is being extracted and is in a threshold object is being created. You don't see that. That's of course just happening either on the agent or on the collector. And every time another event is being encountered that has that same insertion string, the counter goes up. So for example, we can see here, threshold object number 1, user A, well, that user logged on 3 times within that time period, whereas user B only logged on twice, but user C logged on 4 times, triggering the threshold. And user D, as in Delta, only logged on once. And that's very powerful because now we can only trigger the threshold and then a potential alert when it's actually relevant. So we're not throwing everything in one bucket. We're actually looking at each insertion string, in this case, each user individually. And you can see that this particular threshold here is set on the collector side. And that makes a lot of sense too, because if you have multiple domain controllers, people logging on to multiple domain controllers, you want to evaluate that threshold on the collector side where all the events flow and come together. So then it won't matter if they're logging on to domain controller 1, 2, 3, or 4, they're all going to be processed together. And you can properly evaluate that. So now it's really, really easy to say, well, I just want to know if a specific user logged on, successfully failed, whatever that may be, more than X times within a certain time period.